Horatio Spafford Sr. had a successful law practice in Chicago, and it seemed that, life for him was going really well. He and his wife Anna were living in a north side suburb of Chicago. It's a middle upper class, probably in fact into the upper class suburb, and they were living there with their 5 kids, Annie, Maggie, Bessie, Tanita, and their only boy, Horatio Jr. Now, until now, it seemed that they had led a charmed life. They had everything going their way. However, in 1870, their faith was tested by tragedy when their only son, their 4-year-old Horatio Jr., died of scarlet fever. Now, of course, the Spaffords were devastated. I would expect that. But then, on top of that, only a year later, in October of 1871, the Great Chicago Fire broke out, and Horatio and his family faced another test of their faith. Only a few months before, now being a wealthy man, he had heavily invested in real estate by the shore of Lake Michigan. The Great Chicago Fire destroyed much of the city, along with most of Spafford's holdings. Even still, the Spaffords didn't despair. Their home had been spared, and they still had the 4 girls. God had been good. Even though their finances were mostly depleted, Anna and Horatio used what resources they had left to feed the hungry and to help the homeless and care for the sick and the injured and that had been injured in the fire, and also to provide comfort for their grief-stricken neighbors. In 1873, Anna Spafford's health was failing, and hoping to put behind the tragic loss of their son in the fire and to benefit Anna's health, the Spaffords planned a trip to Europe. They planned to travel together by boat to Europe in November, but as sometimes happens, God had other plans. The day they were to sail for Europe, Horatio had a business emergency and he just couldn't leave. So, not wanting to disappoint his wife Anna and their 4 daughters, he sent them on ahead, and he planned to follow on another ship in a few days. On November 22nd, 1873, the steamer that Anna and the girls were traveling on was struck by a British iron sailing ship. The steamer, with Anna Spafford and her 4 daughters aboard, sank within 12 minutes in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Only 81 of the 307 passengers and crew members survived this tragic shipwreck. An American cargo sailing vessel arrived in time, though, to save the survivors of both the sinking ships. And Anna was picked up and taken to Cardiff, Wales, where she telegraphed her husband, and her cable was brief and heartbreaking. It said, "Saved alone. What shall I do?" Horatio and Anna's 4 daughters had drowned. As soon as he had received Anna's telegram, Horatio left Chicago without delay to bring his wife home. While he was sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, the captain of the ship called Horatio to the bridge, and he informed him that they were now passing the place where his daughters had drowned. So that night, alone in his cabin, Horatio G. Spafford penned the words to his famous hymn, "It is well with my soul." Even in the most horrendous storm of his life, Horatio's faith in God never faltered. Listen, if you are in a storm today in your life, you need to know that Jesus can calm the winds and the waves. But on the other hand, I think we also need to know that He may decide to actually leave you in the storm and instead calm the fear in your heart, as He did for Horatio, who wrote that song, "It is well with my soul." Either way, the storm ceases to matter when Jesus shows up. The reason being is that though through any storm we face, we can always know that Jesus is in control during the storm. Now let's go to Mark chapter 6, and let's start at verse 45 and read the words there. Immediately He made His disciples get into the boat and go before Him to the other side, to Bethsaida. Well, He dismissed the crowd. He, by the way, is Jesus. And after He had taken leave of them, He went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and He was alone in the land. And He saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, He came to them, walking on the sea. Now last week, Jason Hayes had shared from Mark's Gospel the story where Jesus had fed the 5,000 men, plus of course the women and the children, with just a very small amount of bread and a couple of sardines, and everybody was satisfied. Now, as the passage was unpacked, we were challenged to see, like the disciples did, that we are incapable of satisfying people, and that only Jesus is capable of satisfying theirs and yours and my deepest hunger and quenching our thirst. We also were taught to recognize that religion or worldly pleasure just can't satisfy, not completely, not fully, only Jesus. It's when we finally see through the vanity of this world and fix our eyes on Jesus, the bread of life, that we can experience true fulfillment. And to press home the point, Jason used the John Piper quote that says, God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. And that quote is so true and absolutely accurate in our Christian walk. Now, after that event of the feeding of the 5,000 and the lesson learned, you'd think that the disciples had it all figured out by now, but they didn't. Not yet anyways. They still had a few things to learn. So now we pick up the story after the hungry crowd had been looked after. And at this point, Jesus immediately sends his disciples away, as we read, before he dismisses the crowd. Now, why would he do that? I mean, he has a great ministry going on. Why doesn't he stay there and stick there and work off of this great opportunity that was presented? Well, Mark doesn't tell us, but in John's account of the same story, he tells us that after the crowd had been fed, there was a move to take Jesus and to make him king by force. And that was absolutely the last thing Jesus wanted. By the way, it was the same offer Satan had given him during his temptation in the desert, if you remember. And he had rejected it then. And he could see it coming now, once again. And he didn't want his disciples to be tempted with this immediate gratification. And he didn't want them to get caught up in this nationalistic outburst. I mean, they weren't ready to handle that kind of temptation. So Jesus sends away his disciples. And then he turns to the crowd and he calms the crowd. And he says goodbye to them all. And then he goes away alone to pray. The next thing we see is the disciples now out in their boat in the middle of the storm. And I think it's of interest to note that they were in the storm because Jesus sent them there. And not only did Jesus send them there, Jesus knew ahead of time that the storm was coming. I find that quite interesting. Now, there are some people who think that if you have enough faith, Jesus won't ever steer you into the storms. That this life is actually made for you so that you can discover the best you ever, one that won't ever have to experience a storm. That is, if you have enough faith. But the truth is, storms are to be expected in this life. However, they aren't to be feared. And that's what faith does, doesn't it? Faith in Jesus doesn't eliminate the storm, but it'll eliminate the fear. Now, granted, sometimes we'll see the storm clouds ahead and we're going to be thinking, well, Jesus isn't going to let me go through that storm, but man, he's taken me awfully close. But then the next thing you know, you're entering a downpour, a deluge, the wind's howling, and you realize it's just not any storm. This one's a doozy. And you're looking out all the wreckage and the debris flying about, and you're thinking, what are you doing taking me into this mess, Jesus? But that's the point. Jesus allowed you to go into that mess on purpose. Now, what do you mean, you might be asking? Well, after all that they had seen Jesus do, the disciples were just absolutely still filled with doubts and fear. And Jesus uses this storm to reveal something or some things that the disciples seem to keep forgetting. His deity and his power, namely. You know what? Jesus will sometimes send us into these storms, or even will use the storms we find ourselves in on purpose. Now, why would he do that? He would do that in order to teach us about who he is. That's his deity and power, and in order to help us grow more and more into his image, in order to make us look like him and to work towards the ultimate good as well. Jesus allows what he allows for our good and for his glory. And we see that in Romans 8:28, where it says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. You also see that in 2 Corinthians 4 as well, where we read, for this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Listen, church, Jesus never lets a good storm in our lives go to waste, ever. Okay, now back to the story at hand. To kind of put it in perspective for us, the Jewish night ran from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., and it was divided into 4 watches. It went from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., 9 p.m. then to 12 midnight to 3 a.m., and then 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Now, Mark says that it's about the 4th watch, would make this about then approximately 3 o'clock in the morning. It's at that point that Jesus looks out from the mountainside, out across the lake, and he sees that the storm was so violent that despite all their efforts to control their boat, The storm had driven them nearly 4 miles out into the middle of the sea, meaning then that it being the fourth watch of the night, they would have been rowing and straining at their oars for upwards to 9 hours. So these guys, they are totally exhausted. By the way, there's a hint of Jesus' deity here. Jesus could see clearly his guys struggling and that they were exhausted 4 miles away in the middle of a storm. And you know what? I personally have a problem reading the directions on a frozen pizza package. But Jesus knows the disciples are terrified. He sees that. They're struggling and they're afraid and they're going to die, and he knows that's in their heart. Yet Jesus uses the very thing they fear as a means to get them, and it's called the storm. And by doing so, he demonstrated his control over their situation by now walking down the mountain, then walking on the water, and then later by calming the storm. They needed to be reminded that Jesus is in control, not the circumstance, and certainly not their fear. You know what? There are times when life appears absolutely out of control, doesn't it? I mean, be it a divorce, a child getting arrested, or alcoholism, or drug addiction, or a son or a daughter who's walked away from God, or maybe it's losing a job, or finding yourself in a deep, dark pit of depression, or a call from the doctor that it's the C word, that is cancer. Whatever it is, there are times when life just appears absolutely out of control. But let me remind absolutely every child of God that's listening today that Jesus is still in control. He is walking on the waves of your stormy life, and he has the power to calm those waves at his will. Faith is saying then, I don't trust the waves because they'll drown me. I don't even trust myself because I can't stop this storm, but I can trust Jesus, who is absolutely worthy of my trust and my faith. And guess what? He's in control. Which brings us to the second point. Jesus, in control, reveals himself during the storm. You see, not only is Jesus in control, he's in control because of who he is. And to bring further confidence to the disciples, Jesus reveals himself, who he really is. And because of who he really is, we can trust him to say and to do what he says and what he does every time without fail. In fact, let's finish verse 48. I didn't completely finish it at the first time I read it through. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And then this is where Mark adds something interesting here, as Mark is known to do. He continues on to say, he meant to pass by them. Now, why would Mark mention this passing by them thing? It almost sounds like Mark is saying that Jesus was not really that concerned, that he was maybe even unwilling to help, or maybe he was needed to show these guys some tough love. But actually, this is not what Mark wanted us to see here. You see, this expression of God passing by is actually quite common in the Old Testament. For example, when Moses was up on the mountaintop, as we read in Exodus, God revealed himself to Moses by passing by. Let me read that portion to you. Moses said, "Please show me your glory." And he, God, said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim you before my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But," he said, "you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And the Lord said, "Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by." You know, another example of this is in the appearance God made to Elijah, who was hiding in a cave after his flight from Jezebel. And at one point, God called him out of the cave so that he could pass by. Listen to this. And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by. You know, we see other examples of this passing by in the New Testament as well. John the Baptist sees Jesus, and he's passing by, and he says, "Look, the Lamb of God." Find that in John chapter 1, right away, early on in the Gospel. So understanding the context, the original reader of Mark's Gospel would know that Mark was making a clear reference to Jesus' divinity. For Jesus to pass by is not meaning that he was about to sneak past so that he could get to the cabin first before the disciples and get the choice of bedrooms. No. Rather, in fact, it's just the opposite. Jesus wants to reveal himself to the disciples, and us, by the way, as God, and invite us to faith, to trust in him. This is also the case in the Old Testament, where God passes by, not to hide, but to reveal himself and to invite to faith, as we saw in those examples I shared earlier with Moses and Elijah. So we see that Jesus is in control, and he's in control because of who he is. God made flesh. He is divinity. Which leads us into point number 3. Jesus strengthens our faith during the storm. Okay, Jesus is walking on the lake intending to pass by in the presence of his terrified disciples. But instead of recognizing his deity, what do? They respond in terror, not in faith, not recognizing that before their eyes, Jesus himself is passing by as very God. Okay, so let's start again in verse 49. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. And they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. I think this begs the question, why didn't they recognize Jesus? Well, the answer is they weren't looking for him. Now, had they been waiting by faith, they would have known him instantly. But instead, they jumped to this false conclusion that he was a ghost. And the point is this: fear and faith cannot live in the same heart, because fear frequently blinds the eyes to the presence of God and then leads to a hardness of the heart. Instead of experiencing what theologians call a divine epiphany, which is a fancy way of saying a glimpse of God's presence, the disciples are fearful and so then clueless. Mark makes that point even more clear when he says that they were utterly astounded, pointing out that they did not understand about the loaves. And why did they not understand about the loaves? Because their hearts were hardened. You see, church, they still hadn't put 2 plus 2 together. They hadn't connected the dots about Jesus' creative power. I mean, his divinity had been put on display right there at the feeding of the 5,000, and yet they couldn't or they wouldn't see it. And so their hearts were becoming hardened. In fact, they were like the Pharisees who saw Jesus yet wouldn't or couldn't recognize him for who he is, God. And if the disciples couldn't figure it out soon, they would have hearts hardened to a point of no return, as we did see ultimately in Judas's heart later on. Listen, don't allow your heart to become like Judas's, or for that matter, the Pharisees. Recognize Jesus for who he is, as God who came to save. Well, because of the hardness of their hearts, the disciples almost missed the wonderful assurance of God's presence in their time of struggle. Instead, they imagined a ghost had come to terrify them further. And so, because they couldn't or wouldn't see the clues that he was leaving for them, that he was showing them about his divinity, Jesus identifies himself by saying something that should have absolutely cleared up any doubt. "It is I," he says. And you know what? By that simple statement, he declares that he's God, that he is the Lord of heaven and earth. Now, how so, you might ask? You know, when I walk into my house and I say to my wife, "Hey, it is I don't expect her to come running and crying out, 'My Lord has returned.' So what makes this statement of Jesus different? Well, it's in the original text. The words, "it is I," can accurately be translated, "I am." And for those who might not know it, "I am" is the divine name of Yahweh, which God had pronounced in Moses' presence as the glory of the Lord passed by. You know what? This is an emphatic personal pronoun. It's a statement of identification. You could call it a billboard-sized business card. It's as if Jesus were saying, "Hey, fellas, don't be afraid of what you're facing. After all, the I am is here. The creator of the cosmos is with you." Jesus was simply reminding those men of who he is. As I am, he is letting us know that he's all-powerful. He has proven his power time and time again since the dawn of time. By declaring himself as the I am, he's bringing to the disciples' minds his power as it was revealed in the creation of the world, which means a little water being whipped up by a stormy breeze on a small lake is nothing for him to handle. And by declaring himself as the I am, he is helping them to remember the miracles surrounding the deliverance of Israel from Egypt. Over and over, God has proven that he has the power to exceed our wildest imaginations. And you know what? He hasn't changed. In fact, he is still God. And he is still the great I am today. Here in Dartmouth, at LifeBridge, in your car, your place of work, in your home, in your situation, in your circumstance. If you have a mountain that needs moving, he is the only one who is qualified to get the job done. In fact, listen to what Isaiah has to say about God. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance. He's speaking about God here. This verse reminds us that God is able to spread his fingers and cover all the stars of heaven with one expand. It could also mean that he places them in their orbits even with a simple flick of the finger. The Greek word used to describe his power is omnipotent. If he has that kind of power over the inanimate objects around us, imagine what kind of power he would unleash on behalf of his children. That's you and me. So you can trust him. He has the power to help. Trust him, church. Being the I am, he is always God, all the time as well. There has never been a time when he did not exist, and there will never be a time when he will not exist. Basically, all the times that ever were or ever will be are right now to God. The Greek word that expresses that thought is that he is omnipresent. That is what makes his words in Matthew 28:20 mean so much when Jesus said, the I am says that he will not leave us or forsake us. The term literally means that he's not going to run out on us when the chips are down. God is not a fair weather friend. He is an all weather friend. He is not an absentee father. He is the doting father. And you know what? Even more, his name, I am, also means that he's all knowing. The Greek word used is omniscient. That means that nothing escapes his gaze. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but whenever planes are taking off or landing on aircraft carriers, the captain watches from the bridge. And even if the planes are flying around the clock, he'll stay on the bridge, catnapping between runs if necessary, so that each time a pilot takes off in his high-speed aircraft or lands on the deck of that floating airfield, he knows that his captain is watching. Wherever we are, whatever bold endeavor we're involved in for him, or whatever battle we might be fighting with our spiritual enemy, we have the confidence that the Lord of hosts is with us, never sleeping, but always attentively watching. The disciples learned a valuable lesson that night in the Sea of Galilee, and that lesson is this: never, ever, ever count God out. You may think he isn't around and that he doesn't care, but in truth, he will never leave you and he will always be at your side. He is always available for you. No matter what you face in life, no matter where you journey, Jesus is always there, and he is always seeking your best interests. Now, there may be situations come up that we have no control over. There may be rough times ahead for the church and for God's people. There may be economic crises and political upheaval. There may even be more pandemics. But through it all, know that God is enough. He is all we'll ever need to meet the needs of life that arise. God and God alone is our hope and our help as we journey through life. He is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient, which again means that he is all powerful, that he is everywhere and present in every time, and that he is all knowing. And that is why we can find peace even when we face hard times, because Jesus provides peace during the storm. This is the story of Jesus arriving at a rough time in a miraculous way and coming up alongside the disciples and joining them and getting them through the rough time. This is the story of Jesus getting in our boat and giving us peace even in the middle of our storms, and teaching us that when we have Christ, we have everything. Now, here's the thing about the disciples at this time. They didn't have Christ with them yet unless he was physically present with them. It wasn't until Jesus ascended to the Father that he said he would send the Holy Spirit to live in us. Now, no matter what the circumstances are, we who are his disciples now have Christ with us always, and he will bring us through it every time, whatever it may be. When we are his and he is ours, we have a song of peace. We can sing like Horatio that it is well with our souls. In Acts 16, we can read about Paul and Silas praying and singing hymns while chained up in prison. Now think about that. They're thrown into prison, landing on the cold, hard ground with open wounds, maybe a broken nose, a couple of broken ribs. No doctor, no nurse, no Band-Aids or ibuprofen. Yet because they have Christ with them, they're able to sing and they're able to pray. When you have Christ with you, when you have Christ in you, you have a song in your heart, a song of peace and victory, not a song of terror and defeat, no matter the circumstances. I mean, do we still cry out for him? Absolutely. But he lets us know that he's with us and he gets us through whatever it is. When he joins us, when we willingly receive him, he enters into our very being. He joins those who put their faith and trust in him in such a way that no matter what we go through, we have peace in the middle of a storm because we have him. That's Jesus in our hearts, within us. Now, what is interesting to me, something I thought about while reading this passage, was that on the water, Jesus doesn't even need the boat. I mean, he's doing absolutely fine without them or their boat, but they sure need him. So many people know Jesus is there just outside their boat, but they won't let him get in. He wants to get in, not for his own sake. He wants in for the sake of us in the boat. And when we allow him, he gets in our boat and he allows us to partner in his work with him, even though he can do it quite fine without us. Thank you very much. Does Jesus need us? No. But he allows us the privilege of being used for his glory in his work. But letting him get on the boat isn't even enough. For us disciples, that's just a step. It's not enough just to let him in on our boat. We've got to let him steer. And when we do, we're going to be amazed at what he'll do. In John's account, we read this. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. By the way, did you notice this miracle? This is another display of Jesus' divinity, I think that's often missed. When they willingly received him into the boat, bam! 1 second they're 4 miles away from land, and the next they're at the place where they were only minutes before working so hard at trying unsuccessfully to get to. I don't know, I'm thinking teleporting. However it was, when we have Christ guiding us, he'll take us places where we couldn't ever steer into ourselves. And even when he doesn't calm the storm, he can maneuver within the storm so much better than we could, even in calm weather. Ever been whitewater rafting? When you're rafting, you have a guide who steers the boat. And what do? Your job is to paddle. I mean, our job isn't to steer that boat in the whitewater rapids, it's to paddle. Now the guide, might say right forward or left side backward, or she might say all forward, or he gives the directions and steers. And what do? You paddle. The guide knows the river. You don't know the river. She or he knows where the rocks are below the surface. They know where the whirlpools are that'll suck you under. So we listen to the captain of the boat, and we do our job. We just paddle. Today, some of you are sitting out there realizing, I need to give up control of my own boat. You're already a disciple. You have Jesus in the boat, but you're still trying to be the captain, and you're still trying to steer the ship, and you consider him only simply your first mate. You might not say that, but in practice, that's how you're treating him. You like giving Jesus the orders. Instead, you need to start following orders, and you need to do it by saying yes to whatever and wherever he's calling you to. Aye, Captain. I mean, that's what we need to say. Yes, Jesus. We're meant to know Jesus intimately, and as we do, we are to learn to hear him, hear his voice, and then obey him. It's not the other way around, church. Some of you might need to start by letting him on your boat in the first place. He's saying, "It is I, do not be afraid." And you need to know that the storm might not immediately be calmed even as you let him in the boat. Satan may stir up the waters even more so that your ship tosses worse than it ever has. But when Jesus is there with you, there is no need to fear. So let Jesus on board and let him take the wheel of the ship. He can get you safely past the obstacles, safely through the storms. Listen, when Jesus is in control, you'll see him for who he really is, the great I am. And your faith will be strengthened, and you'll live a life of no fear. And no matter the circumstance that you end up finding yourself in, you'll be able to honestly say, like Horatio, "It is well with my soul."